Hello and welcome to another edition of YCT Matters. I'm Carol Platt-Liebau, the president of Yankee Institute, and today we are delighted to be joined by Leonard Gilroy, who is the vice president of government reforms at the Reason Foundation and the senior managing director of Reason's Pension Integrity Project, along with Marina Trujillo, who is a policy analyst at the Pension Integrity Project at the Reason Foundation. And we are especially delighted to have them because they are authors of Yankee Institute's most recent study, The Case for Connecticut's Fiscal Guardrails. And Leonard and Marina, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Carol. Thanks for having us.
We're delighted you're here. So I thought we should really, in the immortal words of Julie Andrews of The Sound of Music, begin at the very beginning or start at the very beginning. And let's just start by talking a little bit about what exactly a pension is. I mean, what is a pension and why do they matter?
No, great question. First of all, thanks again for the opportunity to be here today and to collaborate on a project related to this issue, because they tend to be one of those issues that people hear about. They think they know what it is and they think they know what it means. But in fact, what you tend to find is a very kind of complicated situation underneath. And so it's become a pretty important public policy matter over the last few decades, particularly at the state and local level. So essentially, public workers, government workers in the United States, by and large, I'd say at least 90+% of them do not get the same kind of retirement offerings that folks in the private sector do. For those in the private sector, like probably all of us on this call, typically you work for an employer, you have a 401k style plan where, you put in some money, the employer puts some money, you choose where to invest it. And, the goal would being to essentially build a retirement nest egg over the course of a career that may go from many different employers over time, and that can sort of follow someone through their life, so that when they get to retirement age, that they have got essentially what you want is a three-legged stool in retirement, a combination of Social Security and your own personal savings, and then the third leg of that stool is typically an employer provided retirement plan. So the thing in the public sector, it works a little differently. In the public sector, it has been a traditional historical offering that they don't get the sort of what are called defined contribution plans in the private sector. They're typically offered what's called a defined benefit pension plan, and where essentially you as an employee contribute money and your employer contributes money toward a retirement plan that the state or a government entity manages, a large trust fund that essentially does pooled investment. And what they essentially do is promise a guaranteed retirement benefit through that pension in retirement, meaning with a formula where it's guaranteed. And essentially, if you work X number of years at these levels of pay, then we can plug all of that into a formula and tell you exactly when you retire, you're going to make this much money through a pension in retirement. And if the pension system doesn't generate the investment returns out there in the marketplace needed to provide that benefit, that is guaranteed actually by the government, which then means it's guaranteed by taxpayers. And so I guess in a nutshell,
Sure. Leonard, just to pop in here, so that is the difference. A lot of employers will contribute to their employees in the private sector to their 401ks, but it's a defined contribution. They say, we'll put in this much, but then whatever happens, you get kind of, in the words of everybody's favorite preschool teacher, you get what you get and you don't get upset. But under a lot of these government pensions, it's a defined benefit. They say, okay, given all these formulas, you're going to get this certain amount. And if, the investments and everything else don't guarantee it, the taxpayers are going to make it up because you're going to get this certain amount come hell or high water.
That's exactly right. And I mean, essentially the logic of how that started, dates back, a century, essentially, back into the 20th century. And the logic essentially was that for most public workers, you were going to work for a lower paid career. And back then, lots of folks worked in one job for a full career. So the logic of, well, most folks are full career workers. And in this case, they're going to work for, basically probably less compensation than they might get in the private sector, then we'll offer this other benefit that has a guarantee on it. And that now, 100 years ago, that looks like a different value proposition than it looks today, where
Right.
you have tons of market risk out there. That means guaranteeing any income is extremely difficult, especially when taxpayers are on the hook for it. But also the workforce has completely changed. We live in a different technological era. We're not coming out of the, sort of post World War I and World War II environment and those kind of post, the sort of early industrial economies. We're now, in a different zone where most people coming out of college are going to work 5 to 10 jobs in the course of their lifetime. The idea that you're going to work for one employer for a 20 to 30 year full career such that you get that full pension, doesn't really happen anymore. And so the world has sort of shifted, I think, in the workforce, generally out there in the economy. But, in the private sector, also used to back in the day, decades ago, offered defined benefit pensions too. But back in the 70s and 80s, you saw this really accelerate in the 80s and 90s, a shift away from that because companies that can go bankrupt realize when they have all these sort of long-standing liabilities on their balance sheets out there, that can really wreak havoc on them from a sort of economic sustainability standpoint.
Sure.
Governments, by definition, are sort of backed by taxpayers and are sort of, some permanent entities. And so the logic there is, well, they can guarantee it.
Yeah.
What's the risk?
Right.
And
Right.
what we've found is that risk, to put a point on it, Carol, is it's of over $1 trillion now. If you add up all 50 states' unfunded pension liabilities, and local governments and school districts with them, you ultimately get to over $1 trillion currently of unfunded liabilities. And 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. But we've seen in addition to all the sort of demographic changes, our economy, our interest rate environment, everything has sort of shifted a lot over the
And
last few decades, and that's caused that
when you talk
kind of
about
hole to open.
unfunded pension liabilities, Leonard, for our listeners, what exactly do you mean by unfunded pension liabilities?
Great question. So before I confuse anyone with jargon, um, it's a debt, and it's a debt that you owe. So let me simplify it because unfunded pension liability sounds very nerdy and wonky. What it really means is the government has promised X in terms of pension liabilities for all of its workforce, now, past, future, past, current, future, right? You're promising these benefits.
It's what we've
And
promised to pay all these workers, right?
well, it's what you've promised, but what you've promised is just your total liabilities. That's just what you owe them.
Right.
The unfunded part is what you haven't saved and set aside for that.
Right.
And that's the real challenge. And some folks would say, "Oh, come on, Len, you're being too crazy with this. Like, you're not going to, if no, not everybody's going to retire tomorrow, and you're not going to have to come up with billions of dollars of retirement money instantly to give them, and you have time to work through that." And there's some grain of truth in all of that. But the other grain of truth that I think matters much more for taxpayers is that because of unfunded pension liabilities, and we'll talk about yours, through the course of this podcast in Connecticut. But what has happened is we've had generations of promises for which governments have not saved sufficient dollars then to match that promise. And so what an unfunded liability is, what it basically says is you've promised X, but as of today, you have only saved Y. And Y, if you do all the math and all the projections and bake in all the assumptions that pension system has, if they run that out into the future and they say, essentially, if we have X assets on hand today that, if invested properly according to our plan, is going to generate this over time, the difference between that expectation and what you've actually promised is the unfunded liability. And like the thing that everybody should understand, especially the taxpayers in Connecticut who are footing the bill, is that these are constitutionally protected liabilities, meaning
Right.
the courts say once you promise that, you are going to pay it no matter what.
You're on
You'll
the
shut
hook.
down your
Right,
you're on
right.
the hook.
I mean, it doesn't
Yeah,
matter what you have to do to make these promises good. It's sort of
correct.
like telling a normal person, you don't have sufficient retirement savings for your expected lifespan. And no matter what you have to do, they're saying to the taxpayers of Connecticut, you have to come up with this money. Doesn't matter whether you have to raise taxes to 99%. You have to come up with this money. It is a constitutional obligation. And
Correct.
and that is, why I think all of us pay such close attention to it. And
And
so,
if I might add, it's
of
the
course,
huge challenge is also because we don't exactly know the obligation. We are putting money aside, setting up money aside today for someone that will retire in 20, 30 years. So really pension debt is very volatile, and we'll see that as we discuss the results that we discovered in this study, because it really is a well-educated guess, and we make many assumptions when trying to estimate what is that pension debt, how much will we have to pay, and when those assumptions change, the size of the debt also changes.
right. And so, Marina and Leonard, so Connecticut has traditionally had our state employees and our state teachers' pensions have had a reputation as being some of the most underfunded in the entire United States. Obviously, in recent years, their status has improved, partially because of the fiscal guardrails. Could you talk to us a little bit about what these fiscal guardrails are and why they were so important to your analysis?
Mariana, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So the fiscal guardrails are a series of policies that restrict spending and set aside a share of revenue to a rainy day fund, what is called the budget reserve fund. It includes a spending cap, which limits the growth of spending in Connecticut as a proportion of personal income and inflation. Also includes a revenue cap, which restricts how much of the general fund can be appropriated, and sets aside a significant chunk to, as I explained, the budget reserve fund. And when the budget reserve fund overflows, when we set more money aside than a certain amount, that money gets sent to Connecticut's pensions, specifically Connecticut's public employees pension, SERS, and the teachers pension, SDRS. And those measures also include a bond lock, which is a contractual agreement between Connecticut and its bondholders that it is in practice a promise that Connecticut has made to its bondholders that it will not change its guardrails. So they are a very robust set of fiscal measures that have led to over $7.7 billion being sent to Connecticut's pensions, which it is the source of all of this improvement we have been seeing. As the report outlines, SERS, the public employee pension, has gone from being 36% funded, and we're going to use that term a lot. The funded ratio, funded just means considering, as Glenn explained, the liabilities of everything you owe. How many assets do you have? How much, the why, and what ratio is that of liabilities to assets? And that is the funded ratio. And SERS, the public employee pension plan, went from being 36% funded in 2017 to now being over 50% funded.
Which is a wonderful achievement. I mean, Yankee
Absolutely.
Institute was very proud to be part of the commissions that put the guardrails together in 2017. And we're very pleased about the progress that it's made. Obviously, we have farther to go. But underfunding the pensions, as we know, before we move forward, I figured we'd take one quick look into the past, started decades ago. And I know that the State Employees Bargaining Agent Coalition, some of the collective bargaining agreements in 1992 and 1997, it was the politicians and the unions, and they kind of got together and they kicked the can down the road. And they both made, I don't know whether either of you wants to comment on that, but they both made this decision that they would underfund the pensions in exchange for sort of more upfront agreements. Am I correct in that?
Sort of. I would frame that slightly differently. Connecticut is in a very unusual situation. I mean, we've never really seen, outside of maybe some local governments where this might be a little more common, but in the state level, it's sort of unprecedented to have a pension benefit that can change over time based on collective bargaining agreements.
Right.
That's wild. Most states, I mean, California, Texas, New York, all of the big states that have had pensions for forever, some of the biggest in the planet. The way it works is you sort of define the benefit in the law, you set up the operating system, if you will, in the law, and then you let that go. And it really takes an act of the legislature to change it, which many have had to do over the last 20 years or so.
It speaks to the enormous power of the government unions in our state.
Right. And so not only, so the first problem is that you don't collectively bargain pension benefits. That's insanity.
Right.
Because you can't even manage that from an actuarial perspective, because essentially the actuaries need to know, and they need to tell the pension system, and then who tells the legislature for appropriations, like, this is what the benefit is. This is what we think is going to happen over the next 30 years. And if we run all that out, here's what you need to put in this year to make it all work. And then next year we'll redo the math to hit the same target. But if at some point in that stream, all of a sudden you just crack into the system and you change it, and you change the operating system like overnight, practically by some compromise agreement, fiat, then that removes your ability to actually manage your pension system in any economically, financially rational way. And so that's what sort of happened to Connecticut. And there's two examples that we flag in the Yankee and Reason Foundation report that's coming out. You mentioned the CBACs, these are the State Employees Bargaining Agreement, Bargaining Agent Coalition.
Right.
That's the entities that basically do these agreements. And at multiple points in time in the 90s, I want to flag these because it's much more sneaky than the way you described it very politely. But, as if they were basically saying,
that's the first time I think I'd ever be accused of politeness to our government union friends, our union bosses. But go ahead.
Here's how. Thank you. Well, no, you deserve more credit than that, Carol. So here's what they did. So essentially, at some point in the 1990s, they could see that things were going to get a little rocky if they weren't already. You could start to forecast this. So what they did back in the 90s is, and this is going to sound terribly jargonish, but I'll explain it in normal, plain human speak in a second. The first thing they did was something called extending the amortization schedule. Okay, so that sounds very complicated. They extended it from 30 years to 40 years. The typical in the United States is somewhere between 20 to 30 years. And what that means, I'll just make it very simple, is what they say is, like I said earlier, you're not going to have to pay off all your pension benefits overnight. So to do the math and to do the annual kind of financial reckoning, you have to set a window of of kind of action of the pension system, a financial window, sort of like if you go and get a mortgage on a house, you have a 30-year payment, usually a 30-year agreement to which to pay that. And it gives you time to kind of manage all of that over a long period. So actuaries and pension systems use that too. So in this case, what they said, so essentially it would be like what they did would be akin to taking a credit card debt and then extending it out over like a much longer period so that it made it more affordable for you to pay that. But in effect, what they didn't tell you is that they're lowering it below the minimum payment needed to keep the thing afloat, so that instead of you actually continuing to pay down your debt, you're making contributions, but the amortization, meaning the ability to manage that debt and pay it down, is not affected. And in fact, the debt keeps growing. And so what you did is you extend it out. It's almost like you took a loan that was a 30-year loan and you extended it out for 10 more years so that you'd lower your payment. But by lowering your payment, it felt good that year, so you could spend all the money on doing something else that the unions and the politicians wanted at that time, right? Because they didn't, rather than spending on something boring like pensions, which we've promised and it have to be paid, we're going to go spend it on shiny other
constitutionally
stuff.
Obligated, yes.
Right. Well, let's go spend on something else that's fun, like a new K-12 program or a new this in state government or new that. And it's not to say that those things aren't meritorious or
but it's
worthy things to
fiscal
consider.
Incontinence is what it is.
Exactly. Well, so then, okay, so that wasn't bad. So think of it as kicking the can on the debt and lowering your payment, but then making it so that in the end, when you lower a payment, interest costs still burn you, right?
Right.
And so you end up paying more in the long run.
Sure, it
It's
balloons.
just like
Yeah.
any other debt, right? So you pay in more because you pay more in the long run because you wanted to pay less
In the
upfront. So
short
that was
term.
one. And then another, again, so sneaky. Now, okay, so there's two different, so even if they hadn't changed that, the way that you amortize your debt, you can do that in a few different ways. Like, if you had, well, just to make it super simple, if you had $1 million debt, right, and you gave yourself 10 years to pay it off, one way you could do it is just pay $100,000 a year over 10 years, and that'll add up to the debt. And that would be like a sort of like a fixed rate mortgage kind of way of paying it.
Right.
Very simple and predictable. Most governments go, well, that's too simple and predictable for us. We want to do it a little differently. So what they do is they say, you know what? Because like money value changes over time and salaries increase over time and people don't make tomorrow what they made today, we're going to assume that the entire workforce is going to have growing salaries over time. So rather than putting in, to pay off that $1 million over 10 years, 100,000 each year in a straight increment that makes it very simple math, they said, why don't we just tie our payment to that payroll that's going to grow, and we'll just put in a fixed amount of payroll so that maybe in year one we put in, like, instead of 100,000, maybe we put in 75, and then the next year we put in 80, and then 90, and then some point it ramp up, and in year 9s and 10 we'll pay like maybe $150,000 a year or 200,000, because that's just how the math works, and we're going to pay it off anyway. And that's they did something called shifting from what I was describing as like a fixed rate mortgage, was called level dollar amortization, where you just have equal chunks to pay off a debt. And instead, they basically are trying to undervalue the upfront cost of that debt and backload it so that
so
you
they
put the
ballooned
big
the
dollars
payments near the end.
Yes. It's like an adjustable rate mortgage, right? It's like the difference between an ARM and a fixed rate mortgage. I don't like to use the mortgage analogy too much because that's a little different.
No,
but
what they
but the
basically did was
mechanism is similar.
they said, we'll pay a little now and then we'll pay the really big chunks at the end.
Right. We're good for it. 10 years from now, we'll be able to make those payments. We'll be able to make like payments 50% bigger than they are today because
based on what
money
evidence,
grows.
my friends?
And we're always 10 years away. You just keep pushing it, and then future never comes.
Right.
So that led to, Carol, to cut to the chase, that leads to a situation where you took two really important mechanisms, not just one, but two, on how you pay off pensions and how much ultimately the citizens in your state are going to pay to service that benefit. And they just said, nah, we're going to go a different direction. We're going to basically take way more risk on the taxpayer's dime. And then that's what happened. And then it didn't work out. And then 2 decades later, you start to have the dot-com bubble burst, and then you have the Great Recession, within a 2-decade period after that. And of course, at that point, Connecticut joined the ranks of like the 5 worst, most hard-hit states in terms of severity of pension.
Well, what it let them do is it let them give salary increases to state workers up front. And then
correct.
In exchange, and it was a terrible, terrible bargain. And really, shame on the union bosses, because they put their workers in jeopardy as well with their pensions and the fiscal health.
Well, they also, yes, and they also, one extra one is because when it costs that much, then over time you try to pay less now so you can pay more later, and then that plays out in the future. Then when it now is later, you don't have the money to give out those pay increases again. Right. So now there's going to be a generation of teachers and state workers who are going to be clamoring, if they aren't already, saying, we haven't had a pay action in a long time. Come on, where is it? Right. And the answer is, it's right there in your pension. It's right there. It's in STRS, it's in CSRS, it's right there. That's where your pay increases went. The pay increases not given are going to the pension systems.
Right. So the fiscal guardrails have been signed into law, and you were able to see that they are doing a good job at reducing debt. You felt like that was working. I mean, so it looks like this has been a responsible approach to reducing debt.
Absolutely. But that might not be apparent at first glance. And this is an important moment for us to clarify give a proper framing to the numbers that we have displayed. And part of this report also includes an interactive dashboard that we invite our listeners and readers to access. And the interesting thing is that if you look at simply the unfunded liabilities, right, the pension debt since 2017, they have actually increased. However, we do know that fiscal guardrails have improved and reduced pension debt. So how come? How can the unfunded liabilities actually have increased, but the fiscal guardrails have helped, with paying them down? And the answer is because for a very long time, Connecticut wasn't being honest with how much pension debt it had. Experts, the actuaries, were estimating that total pension debt. And as I mentioned in the beginning, pension debt is this abstract number. It's a very complicated estimation, relying on many assumptions. And one of the assumptions that pension debt relies on is how much money do you expect to make in your investments, in the stock market and many of your investments. And their actuaries, the Connecticut's pension funds, were expecting to make around 8% in the stock market. And they did not. They did not. So around 2017, that rate was lowered from 8% to 6.9%, which is more in line with historical returns. It is still a complicated discussion. And we do go into the report in a discussion of, are they even going to reach 6.9? And that is a very complicated answer. And 6.9 still poses many risks to taxpayers. But just lowering from 8 to 6.9% in expected returns has meant that the total debt declared increased. So if you look at the numbers, you see that from 2016 to 2017, Connecticut has gained billions in pension debt. Did that really happen, or no? What happened is that now the state has finally reckoned and recognized decades of accrued pension debt.
Right. It's just a more honest way of assessing what actually exists.
Absolutely. And it's a great sign. And that has been recognized by bond rating agencies, which have upgraded Connecticut's general obligation bonds after fiscal guardrails, citing the fiscal guardrails and specifically pension payments as one of the main reasons.
And taxpayers care about that because it allows, explain to people why that is a good thing for taxpayers. In other words, when Connecticut's bonds receive a higher grade, it allows Connecticut to borrow money more cheaply. Correct?
Absolutely, borrow money more cheaply, and not only moving forward, but also improves Connecticut as the appeal it has to future business owners and investors. It makes the state look, because it is a reflection that the state now is a better business partner. It is a more reliable partner to lend money, to provide services, and agree to get paid in a few months or years for those services. It is a reflection of Connecticut's stance as a business partner, and it will yield many benefits to come. So absolutely very important for taxpayers.
Yes. And so if Connecticut keeps sending the money that's been saved by the fiscal guardrails into the pensions, what in your assessment is the best case number of years for both both pension funds reaching full funding?
So we developed a very complex model and visualization on the dashboard that is available for everyone to access. But in the best case scenario, assuming that Connecticut reaches that 6.9% return, we're taking all their assumptions as face value and projecting what would happen if everything that they expected unravels perfectly. And I emphasize that because that often doesn't happen. But in the best case scenario, we're looking at both pensions reaching full funding by 2038. And 2037. So 2037 for SERS and 2038 for STRS, if the additional contributions from the guardrails continue to be sent to those funds. And we also estimated that the guardrails and the additional contributions will save Connecticut about $6.7 billion. And once again, those are savings, fiscal savings to the state that from pension costs without changing 1 cent in retiree checks and benefits. Simply by paying your debt early, you will save $6.7 billion in interest costs. That's what we modeled.
Well, see, and that's an important point because I don't know how aware you are of this, Leonard Marina, but we have a number of special interests in the state that have been lobbying to undermine the fiscal guardrails because they say, oh, we need more money to spend on this, that, or the other. And, it's very important to understand that it actually is freeing up money by not having these interest costs that we need to pay down, that is going to make money available for these other priorities that people want to spend money on. But it's important to go ahead and keep these guardrails intact, because what it is doing is cleaning up these long-term issues, and that it would be actually really destructive to what our state is getting done in terms of clearing up the pension debt, improving our bond rating, doing all these different things to weaken the fiscal guardrails, undermine the funding of the pensions, and doing all these other things in the name of this short-term little sugar fix. Oh, give me a little extra money to spend on my pet program right now. Because we are going to see these cost savings through interest payments that will be available for other kinds of spending, correct?
Yes, and I would even emphasize another interesting impact of paying your debt early. It is that you are releasing pressure off payroll earlier. So what happens is, as the fiscal guardrails and additional payments reduce and eliminate unfunded liabilities, what we call the employer contribution rate, which is the rate at which actuaries, as Ellen was explaining, the mechanism of actuaries coming together, looking at a plan and saying, okay, how much do we have to put in every year to make sure this stays afloat and we're paying the debt? That is, those actuaries determine the employer contribution rate. And the higher your debt, the higher your employer contribution rate is. And right now, Connecticut is putting 80% of its payroll, in addition to its payroll, to its pension. So what that means is, for every dollar that goes into payroll, the actuaries have determined that the state needs to put in 80 cents towards its pensions. And that is because the debt is so huge. So right now, there's a lot of pressure in Connecticut's payroll to cater to pension contributions. As we pay down that debt, that employer contribution rate as a percentage of payroll, which again it's now at 80, is modeled to go down to 3.5%, which means it will be easier to hire and manage your workforce and manage your budget and your headcount as well. Not only as the state, but many of the governmental agencies will have more flexibility to manage their budget and their headcount and their employees.
Well, I mean, that is all to the good. And finally, I mean, just to sort of wrap up, can you just run through overall, how does keeping the fiscal guardrails intact help your ordinary Connecticut taxpayer? How should a taxpayer think, okay, when I look at the fiscal guardrails and I have these people telling me, oh gosh, if we get rid of the fiscal guardrails, the government will be able to spend more money on some service that might help me. Why is it better for me to say, no, let's keep the guardrails intact, we're going in the right direction? Why should I be for that rather than the immediate sugar high of some, sexy little K through 12 program, to use Leonard's recent example?
Well, for taxpayers, it's hard because it's a really difficult thing to see the prudence of just paying the debt you already owe that's sort of hidden out there and buried, but you owe it 100% legally, constitutionally protected, versus, filling potholes in the highways that you drive every day. And so those sorts of trade-offs can be a challenge, right?
But it does matter because it's going to protect people from future tax increases.
Right. No, it's even more than that. I mean, I'd say it's, if you want to have the ability to have the things that, and the quality of life impacts for the things that government provides that folks find value in, it is going to be increasingly poached. If you leave pension problems unaddressed,
right,
then the ability to continue to do those things that are quality of life things will be increasingly diminished through crowd out. The department of the past will devour the department of the future.
And so explain what you mean by crowd out, because it's an increasing amount of the budget is going to be taken over by having to service these pensions, correct?
Right. And that's what's been happening nationally. The cost to governments in aggregate of servicing pension cost, just annual pension costs, have tripled since the year 2000. So over 25 years, they have tripled. They went from being about 6% of payroll a year to about 18 to 20%-ish of payroll. It changes every year, but on average, that's about where we're at. And so what that means is nothing changed nothing changed to the better in those benefits. And if anything, those benefits were sort of incrementally adjusted on a forward look basis in a lot of states after the Great Recession. So benefits aren't getting better, but they're costing the same benefit today is costing 3 times as much as that same benefit 20 years ago. And that's crowd out. That is the cost of all of those governments collectively not doing what I said a minute ago and thinking, well, the taxpayers really are going to care about the potholes more than paying pensions. And the politicians who make that decision for them are, I would say, probably acting in their own self-interest and acting for that sugar high versus the, basically taking care of first things first. The first things you do in a budget are you deal with the must-dos, the must-pays. One of the must-pays that your state has is debt obligations, including public pensions and retiree healthcare and that sort of thing. Yeah. And so if you don't treat that as the first priority, then it will come back and bite you, and your ability to do all the other things that you want to spend that money on will be severely restricted in the future. And so it's sort of you either pay now or you pay much more later in the long run. And there's no solution where you pay less to get out of an underfunding problem. You got to pay more. But the question is, do you pay more now through like fiscal guardrails that you've been doing the last several years? That's pay more now versus pay much, much more later by not having done any of that. And that's what a lot of states have done. So Connecticut is actually, ironically, it fell into the bottom ranks among the states of sort of pension solvency, but some prudent decision making, created an example that other states should absolutely follow to get out of the same thing, so that they don't have to make that kind of trade-off later between current services and the future, and just paying for the liabilities of the past.
Well, I think, that bipartisan decision with the guardrails in 2017 is paying off. And it seems the upshot is we'd be fools to undermine it now. And we are grateful to you, Leonard Gilroy, the Vice President of Government Reform at the Reason Foundation and Senior Managing Director of Reason's Pension Integrity Project, and you, Marina Trujillo, the Policy Analyst at the Pension Integrity Project at Reason. We are grateful to both of you for the study you have worked with us on, the case for Connecticut's fiscal guardrails, and the dashboard we are putting together to let everybody see all of this for themselves. We are grateful for your work with us on this, and we are grateful for your time today. The study will be out soon. The dashboard will be following, and we appreciate your time and your expertise. And so thank you so much for joining us, Marina and Leonard.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. And this is Carol Platt-Liebau. We thank you for being with us for a little pension talk today and a little fiscal guardrails talk. And we look forward to having you with us. This is Carol Platt-Liebau. See you again on the next edition of YCT Matters.